Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Ros Taylor. On today's show, with The Spectator and Telegraph about to be sold and more people shunning Twitter/X, how is the media in Britain changing and what do our panel actually pay to read? Plus, author and trade negotiation expert Dmitry Gorzobinsky joins the panel to talk about the state of British trade and whether the government has a chance to do a better deal with the EU. And in the extra bit for supporters, is a 4-day compressed working week really feasible? Or is an 8-hour day quite enough, thank you? Let's meet today's panel. First up, it's Times radio presenter and columnist Hugo Rifkind. Hi, Hugo.
Hello.
Rishi Sunak is back, refreshed from what I believe was a break in California and enjoying one of his very last PMQs. Was he demob happy?
He certainly seemed more cheerful than usual. He was sort of reckless, but also underprepared, but in a good way. Like, you could tell he'd really not done very much work. So I think every one of his questions basically had the sentence, why did he choose train drivers over pensioners, in it. He just asked it again and again and again in a variety of forms. But there's something about, it is the sort of best Rishi Sunak we've ever seen, which I know is a low bar. But Starmer is, for all his kind of sort of learnedness, he's very wooden at the dispatch box. He always has been. He managed to call Rishi Sunak PM, Prime Minister, 5 times today. 5 times.
Five times in one session.
That's the sort of thing you do once and you go, oh God, no. He did it 5 times in a single session. And it made Rishi Sunak look quite kind of deft and light on his feet, which I had not seen before.
Next up, it's author and columnist Marie Leconte. Hi, Marie.
Hello.
What did you think of PMQs?
I'm busy just going to agree with Hugo, I think. And in that, I think Rishi reminds me now of Ed Miliband after the 2015 election, where I think he took a bit of a well-deserved break and then came back to Parliament. And it was a bit like, oh, Ed Miliband is funny and actually quite charming on occasion. This is very weird. And I feel like a similar thing is kind of happening. But no, in terms of, I don't know, the bigger stuff, I found it quite interesting that I think the kind of like politics of age or like generations is becoming clearer. Like, you do definitely just have the Tories saying, well, the only people we have on side at the moment are pensioners. So we're just going to fight with all we have for specifically pensioners and no one else. And Labour going, well, we kind of represent literally anyone else. So we're just going to sort of fight on that. So I think that that'll be interesting to see what happens with that with the new leader of the opposition, whether that kind of continues that age barrier. I think the other thing is probably like SNP versus Labour bun fights coming. Pete Wishart was especially venomous against Keir Starmer, although Keir didn't seem especially ruffled, and also there are only about 7.5 SNP MPs left, so it's not like it's going to be a massive thing. But it is interesting, I think, to see the extent to which the SNP just really does not like the Labour Party. But yeah, aside from that, it's still PMQs. It still kind of made me want to die a little bit.
And finally, our guest today is an expert in trade negotiations and the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What You Need to Know About It, Dmitry Gorzobinsky. Welcome back to Oh God, What Now?
Thanks so much for having me.
Dmitry, you teach people how to negotiate. And many of us are back at work, and we're considering how underpaid we are. What's the tip you'd give anyone who's asking for a raise right now?
The most important thing is to get the why you want a raise out as quickly as possible and to move on as quickly as possible to why giving you a raise is good for your boss and to anticipate all of the reasons your boss will say they can't do it so that you can diffuse those and move the conversation on to all of the reasons they just don't want to, because that will be far more uncomfortable ground for them and a far stronger place for you to be.
I feel like a member of the Shadow Cabinet here, talking to Rachel Reeves. Just before we sat down, 6 became 5 with the elimination of Priti Patel, slightly surprisingly, from the Tory party leadership race. She's been knocked out, so Mel Stride, who hasn't even launched his campaign yet, gets to fight another day. What did for... You may not be saying this, but Marie just did a sort of victory. What did for Priti Patel?
Well, I think the problem is that, she has no space in the party at the moment because Robert Jenrick has taken over the kind of right of the party angle. Kemi Badenoch has also been trying to kind of play footsie a bit with the right of the party. Essentially, everyone, even Tom Tugendhat, who's meant to be the centrist candidate, is now like, I hate the ECHR more than anyone else in the world, etc. So let's not get carried away. I don't feel massively sorry for Priti Patel.
It could have happened to a nicer person.
You might say yes, but it is a bit like she kind of had her corner of the party, and then everyone else joined her there, and so she just got crowded out. But I think Mel Stride, next Prime Minister. I think in many ways the next Margaret Thatcher.
Maybe it is a good idea to choose someone who, I think has, 2% recognition, if that, among the general public?
Dark horse. Although I will say we were once in the green room for Newsnight together, and I was trying to open a bottle of beer, but there was no bottle opener. So I was trying to do it on the corner of the table, which was not very dignified of me. And he just watched in silence the entire time and refused to help.
Wow.
I thought you were going to say he knocked it off. He just split it with his bare hands.
Did it with his teeth.
Yeah.
Always
with
carries a
sword.
bottle opener. Any other ending would have been better there.
I know. It made it really awkward. Anyway.
I feel like I'm terminally online, and I still don't know if you guys are doing a bit and this person is made up.
He is the only Tory who's more generic than Robert Generic.
Oy.
Yeah. But the thing with Priti Patel is I don't really understand what it means that she's been knocked out, because I don't know which Priti Patel's been knocked out. Is it the old Priti Patel of the Rwanda policy who, bullied people, allegedly, and danced with Nigel Farage and seemed to love him? Or is it the new Priti Patel, who was surprisingly liberal over the riots and criticised Farage for his stance, and about whom the strangest of people keep saying, no, she's actually lovely? Is she not right-wing enough, or is she just the old nutter that they've decided they don't want? You can read both completely opposing dynamics into it, I think.
Well, I think it's both, isn't it? And it's a sign of utter failure when you try and reinvent yourself because you've got a problem and you still come last in the ballot. Robert Jenrick is now in the lead. Is Kemi Badenoch still a lead? Is she just going to pick up support from other people? And if it comes to a runoff with the membership between her and Robert Jenrick, who do you think would take it?
Well, I saw somebody to say how surprising it was that Kemi Badenoch's strategy of slagging off and hating all her MPs hadn't paid off for her. I think she's not popular among MPs. She does seem to go out of her way to upset people, but she is popular among the membership. It's very hard to see how the runoff isn't between her and Jenrick. But if it's not between her and Jenrick, then I think it's in the bag for Jenrick.
Before we start, if you're in Liverpool for Labour conference, or because you simply live there, we have a second show at the Laughter House Comedy Club on Tuesday the 24th of September to follow up our sold-out show the day before. It's a completely different panel. This time, Zoe Grunwald, Rob Hutton of The Critic and the Paper Cuts podcast, and Politics Joe's Ava Santina will be joining Podmasters overlord Andrew Harrison for a quality night of political talk. And we'll be in Hove on Wednesday the 9th of October at the Old Market Theatre, where Dorian Linsky will be joined by me, Raf Bear, and very special guest Jan Ravens. Links to tickets for both shows are at the top of the show notes, and Patreon people get a discount, of course. We'll see you there. It's not just the Tory party that's taking stock after their defeat this summer. The Conservative press is doing the same. How did some of them get it so wrong over Liz Truss? Who should they back in the leadership race? Where is the government going to be at its weakest, and how can they take advantage of that? Then there's social media. Everyone who was anyone used to be on X/Twitter. But now Elon Musk has found new ways to provoke them. A chunk of the left has set up shop on Blue Sky. And they seem pretty happy there. Just a reshuffling of the elite, you might say, irrelevant to most people's lives, perhaps. But will it make it even harder for the left and right to actually talk to each other? Let's start with the Telegraph and Spectator. Marie, they're in a strange ownership limbo right now. What's going on?
They are. As I will start by saying briefly that I used to work at the Telegraph. It was my first job in journalism in 2013 to 2015. And it is quite funny because even when I was there, the rumour persistently in the newsroom was, we're about to get sold. We don't know who to, but clearly the Barclay brothers are done with us. And obviously it didn't happen for a very long time. So it was weirdly a relief on behalf of my former colleagues that it was finally happening, because it'd been 10 years of going, oh. But no, so they're currently owned by the Lloyds Banking Group, but in a sort of holding pattern. And the UAE actually tried to put in a bid for both papers, but that was blocked by the government, essentially, who passed a law saying that foreign governments couldn't own more than a tiny stake in British newspapers. But now, so it's looking like Paul Marshall is going to definitely buy the Spectator, maybe the Telegraph. So he's a really interesting man, actually. Slight spoiler alert, but I've got a big piece coming out on sort of him and other stuff next week in foreign policy. So he used to be a Lib Dem. He was just like, you're kind of like garden variety Liberal Democrat. He worked on the Orange Book, the kind of like big book of centrist Lib Dems of, Clegg fame, etc. Then he went Brexit mad, I believe is the correct term that you use in British politics. In that, he went from kind of being a regular centrist to, after the Brexit vote, taking quite the right turn, and is now, so he's the man behind podcast favourites, Unheard and GB News. And he's, and I do find him interesting because I think he promotes a brand of conservatism that actually feels quite alien to the British Tory tradition. And it may be weird for me to say that as a foreigner, but what he does, and you see that on GB News, I think a lot, to an extent on Unheard, is a very like America-brained, kind of like really hysterical, quite, religion-heavy, etc., form of right or hard right politics. So yes, I'm not really sure what's going to happen when he takes over the Spectator and if he takes over the Telegraph, but I suspect it will probably be reasonably bad news for the country.
Yeah, it's a trajectory we've discussed before, actually. Frustrated Lib Dems going like total right wing. It's quite interesting as a phenomenon. But do we have a sense of what he's clearly combative. He's clearly, Unheard does a lot of culture war stoking, let's say. Is that, but how does it go beyond that? What's the ultimate, what kind of Britain does he want?
God, I'm not entirely sure. I think he probably also just kind of wants to be really influential because he was, so if memory serves, he was actually quite involved in the coalition-y stuff and including the talks between the Lib Dems and the Tories, etc. So he's clearly a man who really enjoys being in the thick of it. And I think found himself outside the thick of it after the referendum, and is now trying to drag everyone to him, I suppose. But I think you've made quite a good point. I'm not entirely sure actually what his vision of Britain is, because again, at least the kind of like traditional Tory right, you can tell what they want. Like, it's not a country I'd love to live in, but you can tell that there's kind of a picture there. But I think the endless screeching of GB News, Unheard, etc., it's not entirely clear to me what world they're trying to build. I think they're kind of actually right-wing people who are more comfortable in opposition is something we've talked about on the podcast before. In the same way that I think a lot of the Corbynite left had no idea what to do when they had some sense of power, at least in the Labour Party. I think these are right-wing people who love shouting down whoever's doing stuff. Well, you're doing it wrong and, and everything's awful. But I'm not convinced, actually, they know what they would do if they had the levers to kind of operate.
I think there's a dramatic difference between Unheard and GB News as well. It's quite interesting that he does both because, GB News is exactly that sort of like right-wing shrieking, and it's supposed to be, and it's down market and deliberately down market. Unheard is a sort of quite hard to pin down because it does very much do that culture war stoking stuff, but it does it from the left as well as the right, at least a version of the left, maybe a sort of a more sort of old-fashioned version of the left. But it also, there's a sort of like regrettable streak of quality quite often in Unheard that makes it quite hard to sort of slam in quite the same way as your normal kind of basic anti-wokery, I find.
Yeah, I agree. I guess he's a disruptor and maybe that's enough, in the sort of Dominic Cummings vein, but for media. That's it. Hugo, the Telegraph gets a lot of mockery for its commentary these days, and I guess you could call it sort of anti-woke boomer angst. That's probably a more fluent way of putting it. But even though it's all behind a paywall, it is popular. And the Telegraph is the fastest growing news website in Britain at the moment. And considering that some of them are free, that is quite impressive. How does it do it?
Well, one reason why it grows so fast is, although it's behind a paywall, it's quite a cheap paywall. It's considerably cheaper than I think any other broadsheet paywall. But also, it does something that nowhere else does. The Telegraph, which is that when you have, generally speaking, when kind of liberal ideas float into the mainstream, every other broadsheet in some shape or form will kind of give them a hearing. You'll have the Guardian that embraces them, the FT that often embraces them but counts the cost. And the Times, you have columnists like me who'll wring their hands and go, oh, well, I suppose we're going to have to try and make this work, but it's not going to be easy. Whereas the Telegraph just says, nope, none of that, nonsense, rubbish. And it says it again and again every single time. And there's a market for that. And what it means is that unless they're going to go to, for example, the Mail or the Express, the Telegraph isn't that worried about losing its core readership because there is nowhere else for them to go. They might lose on a sort of news front, they might lose readers to the Times or the FT, and I suppose on a sort of anti-wokery front, they might lose readers to the Mail. But if they want people who want to read a broadsheet but also want it to be absolutely like kind of nothing Churchill ever did was wrong, then it's the only place. And so it's a really, really solid market.
Yeah, and in that sense, it actually hasn't changed a lot since, I remember my fairly reactionary grandmother reading the Telegraph every single day 25 years ago.
Also, it actually takes quite a lot. I mean, particularly of an older generation, and Telegraph readers are quite old. I think it's 38% of them are over 60, which is higher than most newspapers. It's around 30-ish, I think. It does take quite a lot to get people of that age to stop reading their chosen newspaper. Bear in mind that I think it's something like 150,000 people a day still read the Express.
Yeah, that is a mystery, isn't it?
Isn't it?
What attracts them? Just sheer habit, I guess. You've written for The Spectator in the past, and it feels less vigorous than it used to. Maybe it's just kind of very disappointed by Brexit and doesn't know what to plead for next. Does it need to change as a magazine?
This is the wrong podcast on which to say it. I'll always be very fond of The Spectator. I didn't just write for them in the past. I was a columnist for them for 11 years. And very much enjoyed being one, precisely because how easy it was to kind of go against the grain there. I think it was engagement with Spectator readers that let me figure out what my politics were, and that they very much weren't theirs. But I think the problem the Spectator's had is with Brexit and with Boris Johnson, it got what a lot of its readers, not all of its readers, the Spectator also has excellent books pages and is often a very funny magazine as well. But it got what a lot of its readers always thought they wanted. And then confronted with it, they didn't quite know what to do. And it made the magazine, it sort of stopped the magazine from being edgy and made it a standard bearer for a particular sort of politics. And the sort of arrival of Trump did that even more so. And it used to be a very glamorous magazine, The Spectator, in the sort of David Cameron era. Whether you liked that sort of glamour or not, it definitely was a sort of a glamorous vibe. Made a big deal of its champagne parties and so on. And it's now got more of a kind of sort of bitter vibe a little bit, because the right has risen and it's not done what they wanted the right to do. I would say, in its defence, The Spectator, it does have a different and in some respects more pure journalistic culture than a lot of media, which I think is often poorly understood. There isn't really an editorial line in as far that it affects the writers at all, and it's a magazine that's always delighted when columnists fight each other. Even from extreme positions. The reason why it crosses a line is because it shuns a culture of having an editor stopping people from crossing a line if they want to, which is quite sort of old-fashioned free speech position that in the hack in me can't ever quite totally bring myself to condemn.
But isn't it? Sorry, I guess I will argue with you, but. My slight counter-argument would be that it's still, because I've heard that a lot about The Spectator, but ultimately I feel like, Fraser, the commissioning editors, whatever, still choose who to commission. So I feel like the idea of anyone can write anything. So, it's still from the people who write really frequently for The Spectator are all from, mostly an ideological kind of same background, at least within the right and stuff. So it's not, I could pick 10 of my friends and say, write whatever you want. They would probably not come out with the stuff, that The Spectator.
Yeah, yes and no. It's very easy. It's very easy from a sort of external, more left-wing position, which, let's be honest, is where most people are, to look at The Spectator and not recognise the fact that, for example, Charles Moore and Rod Liddle have extremely different politics, on a variety of fronts. When I left The Spectator, which I did because of contractual obligations elsewhere, I was aware of them thinking that I'd left a bit of a hole in their balance, which they tried to fill in various sorts of ways. But as a writer, an example for you, when they got, I think it was Matt Ridley wrote a cover story about climate change, and which was preposterous. And I wrote a letter to the magazine. I wrote a letter to the editor saying this is ridiculous and for all these reasons. And he said, "Can we run that as a letter?" So that means essentially they had 1 week. One of their columnists published on the letters page saying their cover story the previous week had been nonsense. Not just that I disagreed with it, that it had been nonsense. There aren't a lot of publications that would do that, wherever the writers are coming from.
But they would still not commission you to do another cover story saying, I don't know.
You're right. They wouldn't have. They probably wouldn't have commissioned me to say, "Yay, net zero." But then this was pre-net zero. But then they wouldn't have done that because their readers wouldn't have wanted that. And so, I've talked about this on this podcast before, but I always believe that all publications are more enslaved to their readers than people recognise.
Yeah, they do. They do love the sort of the game and the old-fashioned sparring, which a lot of publications. It's not just that an editor will say no to stuff. It's just that most of the time you don't bother proposing it because you know that they'll say no.
Yeah.
And that's what really kills the variety of opinion, I think, in a lot of places.
I'm not in journalism, so I don't know. But for me, what separates something like The Spectator or any major publication from like a blog or a Substack is the fact that anything you write for them, especially in a cover story, you are effectively borrowing the credibility of the institution. And there is some sense that the institution, through its editorial process, has at least done the basic due diligence of like, does this make sense? Is this morally repugnant to the level of no one should ever put their name on it, and so on and so forth? And so to sort of say, well, they have this open door policy. Well, I mean, so does sort of Substack. The difference here is, I think, when they are consistently putting aberrant views by occasionally aberrant people, with respect not to get personal, and they are lending them the credibility of a very, very prestigious, at least historically, publication. I don't think you can go, well, we're just glorious free speech champions. They're not a platform, is I guess my point.
But I think that's totally fair. But I think it's also important to understand what is understood as being the precise nature of the editorial culture, which I've never worked there as like editorial staff. I was only a contributor. But if you get a cover story on the New Statesman, it is reasonable to assume that is the view of the New Statesman. And I don't think it would necessarily be right to assume that was necessarily the view of the Spectator. It would be right to assume that they have sanctioned it. So when it is abhorrent, then that criticism is valid. But it would not that the culture is not necessarily this would be the view. In the same way that one might say, for example, the London Review of Books, you wouldn't assume a cover story expressed the view of the magazine. Whereas in most of kind of mainstream British journalism, you absolutely would assume that. And I think that's a nuance that's not often understood.
Yeah. How is the right-wing press going to go after Labour, Hugo? Are we beginning to see the traces of a pattern in terms of where they see the weaknesses, the Achilles heels of Labour?
Yes. I mean, it's like this parallel reality that there is this sense Labour is tyrannical and going to destroy Britain with the jackboot of centrism or something. I mean, you can see already there is. I mean, why they made such a fuss about the smoking ban. It's why they've been a lot of the right wing press has been so reluctant to condemn the riots and gets really upset even when you call them riots. There is this sense of kind of, I don't know, this sort of woke Stasi that's about to come down upon us, it makes the debate very difficult because it's always really hard when people really, really passionately express views that you can't even take seriously enough to argue with. And I think that's kind of what's going to happen.
Marie, the death of newspapers has been predicted for a long time. And every year, I think one of them will actually stop printing. But so far, it's just the Independent and the Evening Standard going weekly rather than daily. So few people, though, read them cover to cover, and yet they're still hugely influential. Why? How have they managed to make themselves still relevant?
Oh, again, I would recommend reading my long feature in Foreign Policy next week. It's quite fun. It touches on all of that. But no, as a result, I do have some answers. So I think that there's a number of different reasons. I'm guessing we're kind of mostly talking about politics and kind of political influence. So the first one is the obvious one, which is that politicians still really very much read newspapers, partly because of age, partly because they're not normal people, they're quite weird people, and they want to know what's being said about them. So as a result, you do have this thing in Westminster, you'll go for lunch with an MP or whatever, and they'll say, oh, and did you see like that interview in The Spectator, that feature and blah, blah, blah. You get this sense in Westminster that it's kind of a village where everyone reads the local papers. A. B, I think the thing is broadcasters still follow massively, the newspapers. So you go into any kind of studio, and like for the Today programme, for any kind of like newsy show, even actual paper reviews on Sky or like formerly at the BBC, etc.
Or paper cuts.
Or paper cuts, exactly.
Yeah.
But like even that, or just the news shows in general, the current affairs shows, like the way broadcasters decide what to talk about is that they read the papers. That they look at Twitter as well, to be fair, these days, but they look at the papers. So anything that even, including on the BBC, etc., that gets talked about will be influenced by what was in the papers that day. So I think as a result, they still have that completely outsized influence. And then there's the slight, it kind of feels like a weird like premise for like a YA kind of villain of saying they're just powerful because people give them power, but without, people saying it, they would crumble into dust. But it's kind of true as well. I think, in Westminster especially, there's a lots of people being terrified of the press, but if they stopped, actually the press probably would find that there's not that much they can do. So it's kind of a self-sustaining thing of going, oh God, Fleet Street is really angry at this. If someone decided to go, actually, you know what? Who gives a shit? And I'm not saying that would be a good thing. I'm not convinced that would be a good thing at all for politicians to do that. But if they did, again, I think Fleet Street could huff and puff, but I'm not convinced there's a whole lot it could do.
What, given the choice, I mean, do millennials and Gen Z who are interested in politics actually read? I mean, the people in the bubble, and I suppose because probably the people outside the bubble increasingly just don't. Because we know that this is actually quite a scary thought in a way, because you're describing a world where an elite is talking to an elite and they're pretending that they're addressing the general public, but actually they're not. Those people aren't reading them anymore. But what do they want? What do younger people want to read about politics? Where are they getting that?
Oh, I obviously, I saw this question in the script. So I talked to my many, many, many young and cool friends. So, they're in the thousands really across the country. But no, seriously, I mean, I can speak for myself. I definitely do read Playbook. I think Playbook has probably been very bad, actually, weirdly, for newspapers, because I don't really read political news anymore. I just read Playbook every morning. Occasionally, if it's a big news day, I'm working on something specific, I'll read the Playbook thing in the afternoon, but that's it. And then, and again, this is a terrible thing for me to admit, but I mostly read American journalism, which really annoys me because I don't like it when Americans are smug. But I do much prefer, like, my ideal feature, so I don't really read the news anyway. I love features. My ideal feature is one where the headline does not make it clear at all what the piece is about or the stand first. And then there are 7 paragraphs of Debbie Matson wakes up at 6:45 every morning. She picks up her Marlboro Reds. And then 7 paragraphs in, you're like, I still have no idea what this is about. Like, this is the journalism I love, which Britain does not do at all. But yes, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. Yeah, I just love the New Yorker. Sue me.
I was just about to say, that is basically the New Yorker.
It is. It's so great. Aside from that, I don't really know. And the slightly more serious answer is that I think there was definitely an attempt to capture the kind of like minds and eyeballs of younger people with like Vice and BuzzFeed and all the kind of like very online places, many of which I wrote for. And then they all failed, not because of the journalists or the editors, but because the people with the money were dicks. So actually, I can't really answer that question because I'm genuinely not sure. Like, now all those places have gone.
Is the left-wing press in as much trouble as the right?
Ooh. That's a good question.
What is the left-wing press?
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about, I don't know, New Statesman, for example, we think about The Guardian, we think about Mirror, the old school left-wing publications. Are they, The Guardian has a big readership because it's mostly, unless you look at it on the app, free. But are they struggling to sort of make the weather?
I think they're just, and I do read The Guardian, but it just really is a parody of itself so often, where you just go on the website and it's like, okay, so what am I doing wrong? What should I not be doing? What's wrong about everything? And you just read, and by the end you're like, okay, so it turns out, I cooked pasta wrong. Also the fact that I take baths, is killing orcas. And yes, it's like, I'm just going to close the tab again. I don't really have a point. I'm just complaining about The Guardian, but yeah.
I think, if we're calling that the left-wing press, and I think that, and I don't think this is as a criticism, but I think that is generally at best the centre-left press. I would think it has more of a problem because it doesn't, because it's not left in tooth and claw in the same way that the right-wing press is right in tooth and claw, and so it doesn't have the same kind of loyalty. There is such a thing as sort of slightly left of centre loyalty, as this podcast well knows, but it's not as lucrative as you're sort of headbanger on the right loyalty.
No, you've got Navarra and you've got other players who are more left wing than that.
And Navarra is doing very well, to be fair to them. So yeah,
and fairly, I think.
There is another element here, I think, in that you have to separate, I think, like analysis and commentary from reporting and like journalism in investigative journalism sense. And in the sense that obviously if I want to read somebody like opining on what's going on or analyzing the polls these days, especially if I'm of a younger generation, I can go out and get that with someone with whom I feel like they build like almost parasocial relationships. People feel like, especially in the US, you get this a lot, they feel like they sort of understand Nate Silver and he's in their living room talking to them about polls. They go to podcasters, they find the exact kind of Substack commentator who speak directly to their language and they feel like they trust. And they can do that, and that is hurting newspapers. Where I think it's kind of might be hurting society a bit is that all of that is great, but none of it pays for like Anna Isaac at The Guardian to spend 5 months digging through like data in order to uncover some financial malfeasance at the heart of the city. because Substack journalists probably aren't going to do that. They can't afford to. They need to pump out 1,500 words a week in order to justify their subscription fees. And if you look at a lot of that commentary and analysis, if you dig down far enough and you look at what triggered the conversation, it was ultimately reporting by somebody at a newspaper. And I think that vicious cycle is like pulling the strings apart on the media environment a bit more, as more and more the people making the money are making it off the back of the people doing the work, but not getting paid as much in struggling institutions.
A tiny point I would make as well as a freelance journalist is that the problem is that not all, to be fair, but a lot of publications pay exactly the same rate for comment and for reported stuff, which is mad. So you can literally write a column in 2 hours from your bed, or you can spend 3 days interviewing people, doing research, etc., and you'll be paid the same amount of money. So I think, and I'm sure I speak for all freelance journalists here when I say that sometimes I'm like, I will do the right thing. I will do the big feature and talk to the people for fucking £300 or whatever. But, increasingly at maybe 60 to 70% of the time, I'm like, I'm just going to do the thing where I just write from my bed and I get the same amount of money. So I think it is also a structural issue.
Ask a war correspondent what newspapers are paying for reporting from the front lines of Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon. And it's like, legitimately, they could be driving Uber. And they could certainly be firing off sort of, here are the 5 top ways wokeism is breaking spaghetti, and for the same amount.
Yeah, I think you've seen that with Unlocked Democracy recently and the struggles it's having. A real attempt to do independent investigative journalism, which just isn't financially, can't pull it off.
But it was only ever financially viable because it was subsidized by other things. It was subsidized by the sports pages and the classified ads, and the sort of the horrendous democracy of seeing precisely what people are paid to prepare to read.
Hugo, let's talk about social media. We're running a bit out of time, but people have banged on for ages about quitting Twitter/X in disgust at Elon Musk. But now a chunk of the left actually has, myself included, although I'm still on Twitter because, yeah, virtually all the official stuff, institutional accounts, is still on X. Do you think that's going to change? Are we really going to move en masse?
I think eventually it will change because eventually Elon Musk will do the thing where it becomes a legitimate, embarrassing question, for example, Keir Starmer at PMQs, that says, why do government departments still use Twitter? And he will not, or X or whatever, and he will not have an answer. And the same question will be asked of various brands, not just why do you advertise, why are you active on this platform? Because Elon Musk will have done the thing that makes it sort of beyond the pale. I'm still on Twitter as well. So, I mean, and it's, so I can understand why people are. I guess we are those 150,000 people still reading the Express in a way. It's quite hard to change your behaviour in that regard.
You're on Blue Sky, but you're kind of not on Blue Sky. There's things that you're going to post there soon.
I've posted maybe once or twice. My problem with Blue Sky, try and phrase this right without being rude to anyone. I'm very interested in what a lot of people on Blue Sky say. I have no interest in speaking to them. And not because I don't like them, but because it makes me... It's a bit like we were saying earlier about The Spectator. I realise the reason why I'm on Twitter, apart from through reasons of sort of self-publicity and aggrandizement, is for the fight. It's to come across voices I don't agree with and come across people who, when I say things and they say that is ludicrous and hateful, and whether I agree with them or not, I have to at least understand why. And that's the kind of journalism I've always done. I've always written against the grain in every publication I've been in. It's what I find it rewarding. I find it thought-provoking. And Blue Sky for me at the moment is absolutely the echo chamber that people say that people condemn the British media for. I don't really want to post my stuff and have loads of people say, yes, I agree with your nuanced take on that. There's nothing in it for me.
It's quite nice sometimes.
Marie, I mean, Musk has lost the plot, but as Hugo says, it's a good thing if the Liberal elite go off and play by ourselves. Isn't it actually bad for us?
I think the problem is that, and for the reasons Hugo outlined, it's not really going to work for the majority of people. And I wrote a Substack on that recently because I think that, there's been a few times be that Truth Social or whatever weird fucking platform mad right-wing people went to. And that happened a few times where they all went to their own platform away from the libs, and then they came back, with their tail between their legs going, oh, actually, we're back on Twitter. Everyone made fun of them. I feel like actually Blue Sky is kind of similar, and I'm also trying very hard, but it's not quite sticking yet. Because we need everyone. The point of Twitter was not, I really hate but wasn't Twitter great when everyone was nice to each other and we just had really thoughtful conversations all the time? Bollocks. It wasn't like that. It was, that we definitely had considerably fewer Nazis, which was great. But I think part of the fun was the arguments, as Hugo was saying. So I don't even think that's really viable as a long-term thriving platform to just have people who agree with each other.
Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question to the panel. This week's question comes from Sam Proctor, and he asks, what is the biggest single thing this new government should do to make the biggest impact while it's still in its honeymoon period? I'm not really sure it is, to be honest. I think it's already over. But if it could only choose one. Marie, have you got thoughts?
I would say build an absurd new number of houses, but create several new towns across within commutable distance of London and build the train stations, etc. And I think genuinely and I am biased as a renter in London, but I do think finding a way to making housing cheaper in the southeast and London would change many things.
Excellent. Hugo?
Council tax. Do council tax. Sort council tax. Council tax is nuts. Everyone knows it's nuts. It's an archaic thing, archaic hangover from the 90s.
Revaluation or letting councils raise it, which they can't currently do very much.
Revaluation is the important one, but sensible revaluation across the country, which would hurt, the southeast and the wealthy parts, but would also have much more impact on councils having the sort of money that they need to have. And just make everything honest and sensible rather than weird and nuts. And I say that as somebody who is blessed to live in a quite nice house in London, so really would suffer from that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose I kind of mentally ruled that one out because I thought there's no way that they'd ever do that. But we ought to be audacious. So yeah, that would be a good thing. But I was going to say that we should let councils raise tax because at the moment we have this strange situation. We keep banging on about devolution and how important it must be. But if you've got a situation where councils are constantly having to be bailed out or go bankrupt and have so little control over the financial affairs, and they can't raise it by, I think, more than 4.99%.
The problem with that is it sort of greenlights central government to abandon councils a little bit. The councils that have the most money, that could generate the most money, are not the ones that need the most money.
So you got a sort of Wandsworth situation where they had zero council tax for
exactly.
a while, didn't they? Yeah. That would be a downside. But at the same time, I can't see how you also get more accountability, where they are held properly accountable for what they do, which is a problem at the moment. Yeah, to be discussed. Next up, what's British trade like these days? What could we be trading but aren't? And will we be able to persuade the EU to give us back some of the privileges we used to enjoy without actually rejoining the single market or the customs union, obviously? Dimitri, you just wrote Why Politicians Lie About Trade and What You Need to Know About It. And I suspect many of us know some of the lies the Brexiteers told us about trade. But let's recap, because we've had now more than 4 years to carve out those new markets that Brexit was going to open up. I won't use the word buccaneering at this point. I'll just remind people that it was used. How has what we import and export actually changed since 2016?
So what you've basically seen, the UK didn't sink into the sea, but what you did see is that basically a whole tranche of UK businesses, which tended to be smaller businesses that had built successful business models, making things in the UK, making products, and then selling them into Europe, because that was very, very easy, found themselves locked out of that market by the faff of trading across a goods border that popped into place. So what you have seen is effectively a kind of consolidation of trade in some ways, where bigger UK businesses that have the internal muscle and the capital reserves and the expertise to navigate this kind of faff have more or less done okay. You've also had sort of intermediary players set up, that sort of big players that can facilitate for smaller businesses. So you're kind of facilitated by Amazon kind of stuff pop into place. But basically what you've seen is that UK trades kind of remained roughly where it was. It's perhaps taken a hit, but the composition of that trade has moved a bit towards the larger end of town, with the smaller end of town finding itself unable to export quite as readily as it used to be able to.
Let's talk about one of the post-Brexit deals that the government was especially pleased with, the UK-Australian Free Trade Agreement signed in 2021. What did it change?
So previously, the United Kingdom, as part of the European Union, and even after it left, generally didn't charge many tariffs on goods coming in, except in a few select sectors, especially agriculture. And Australia and New Zealand, for long, boring historical reasons to do with Commonwealth and imperial preferences and so on, had a bit of access into the UK market, so could sell the UK some beef and lamb without those tariffs, but not as much as they'd like. And so what this free trade agreement did was it opened up the UK market entirely to anything that Australia wanted to send them, tariff-free, and vice versa, though Australia didn't really have any tariffs to begin with anyway. So what it means is that Australian farmers can sell to the UK now in greater volumes without the government getting in the way.
And has that been good or bad for British farmers from a purely parochial point of view?
Well, from a trade perspective, it's kind of winners and losers, right? So UK farmers are facing more competition. They haven't been wiped out. It's not apocalyptic, but there is now a whole set of competitors out there in a very efficient agriculturally producing country, Australia, that can sell to the UK in ways that they couldn't before. So that is more price pressure, more competition pressure on UK farmers. On the other hand, it would have had some minor effect against inflation on UK supermarket shelves. So UK consumers, UK restaurants, anybody who might want to buy Australian lamb and beef or just buys lamb and beef would have benefited a little bit.
Okay. Tell us what the government really wants to get from Brussels. What are the key wins that it would like from some sort of renegotiation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement?
So the government is in this place where there are the rules of how trade works with the European Union now, right? You guys can't see this if we're not showing video, but Marie is attempting to tunnel out of the booth. If I say the word trade enough times, she will internally combust, like right there in front of us.
God, I can't believe you busted me like that. Oh my God.
Can you use the word phytosanitary?
This isn't that kind of podcast. I have an OnlyFans for that kind of content. No, so there are now barriers between the two. There are now rules. The European Union does not automatically accept that something made in the UK is acceptable for sale in the European Union the way it would before, and it doesn't automatically accept that a shipment from the UK crossing that border has paid all of the tariffs it has to. That is not changing, and the government knows it can't do anything about that as a principle without rejoining the EU single market that it has ruled out 97 times because it would just be too hard and the price to pay politically it thinks would be untenable. But there is a huge amount of discretion the EU has about how all of that works in practice. So with on the extreme end, where they are searching the lunch boxes of truck drivers, on the coast of France to throw out their sandwiches because they could be an SPS risk, that is a choice the EU made. And it's not about whether you're in the single market. It's the EU basically saying, we are going to be maximalist in how we enforce this because we hate you a bit and because we haven't made the effort to make this work better. So what the UK really wants from the European Union is on a whole range of issues like sanitary, phytosanitary.
Say it again.
Fuck you.
Like on plant and animal health, it wants to basically say, can we sit down together and take these rules as they are now and make dealing with them smoother for UK businesses without crossing any of the EU's red lines and threatening the single market? That is the dream.
And how big a difference would that actually make to Britain? Is the government being upfront and honest about how large a difference it would make to our trade?
Well, this is trade policy. So it's how much difference would it make to Britain? And the average Brit, you won't notice it, chances are. What it will do, and I think this is entirely valid, is make a real difference to some of those traders that are trying to move stuff across those borders. And those are real people with real businesses that employ other real people that have families and that are investing in their local communities. So is it going to raise GDP by 6% a year? No, obviously not. It's a bunch of nerds changing the way rules work at 5 border posts off the coast of the UK. Is it worth doing? Yeah, absolutely, because those people are citizens too, and they deserve the government to make life easier for them.
So what does the EU really, really want in return?
I mean, the EU craves normalcy, I think, more or less. More than anything else, it craves normalcy, predictability. The EU is a very, very slow-moving beast. It doesn't like dramatic shifts, but it does love a good technical committee process working group. So, from the EU's perspective, what it would like to do is take most of the heat out of the trade part of the relationship, accept that things are the way they are, and push all of these issues into working groups that never make the headlines and that make sort of plodding progress through reform. At the same time, the EU has a lot of other non-trade priorities with the UK around security, around the future of the continent, around immigration, around almost everything. And what it would like to do is to kind of build a broader, constructive working relationship around that isn't constantly being dragged down by like fish quotas.
I mean, clearly we're happy to cooperate on security, and that's obvious. What we're not apparently eager to cooperate on is youth mobility, and that seems to be a big sticking point. Does it need to be? Because it's not really freedom of movement, is it?
God, absolutely not. And I'm such a huge fan of youth mobility schemes generally. I think they're one of the coolest policies you can roll out anywhere, giving young people a chance to work and live and just experience other cultures for a while and then come home. Is just an enriching thing for like everybody involved. So I'm a huge fan of them, and I think it's a shame that it's been dragged into this like broader eternal nervous system collapse that is the UK debate over Brexit and immigration. Because you're right, it's not any of those things. The scheme is basically allowing young people to go and work over there for a couple of years and then come back. It has no right for permanent immigration. These people are not going to be competing for top tier jobs, and a lot of the time they're going to be moving around from place to place. The EU has sort of said they would like it, but just so that people understand, visas and immigration are always the like third railiest thing in trade. A lot of trade agreements, if you read the preamble, there will be a footnote right at the front that goes, just for clarity, nothing in this will affect immigration. And then there'll be like a footnote on that footnote that goes, no, we really mean it. We promise none of this should be read as touching immigration. So I can understand why they're struggling too.
Keir Starmer visited Germany and he talked up trade a lot. How much can Germany, though, actually do on its own? Because surely it does need to defer to the European Commission. It can't really agree very much alone, can it?
No, and to be honest, if you dunked on the Tories making a big deal out of signing trade agreements with Idaho, there's an extent to which you should also kind of give them a hard time if they're selling a trade deal with Germany, which they absolutely do not have. You can read the agreement, what they have agreed to with Germany, and it is a whole bunch of non-binding cooperation stuff where they have agreed broadly to work together across every issue on Earth in the broad spirit of Kumbaya. What Germany can do for the UK, and it's not nothing, Germany can be a supportive voice inside EU deliberations. And obviously, given that it's Germany, that voice carries a huge amount of weight when they choose to wield it. And secondly, Germany, there's a lot of things that you can do at subnational level to do things like encourage inward and outward investment, not by changing the rules of the European Union, but by putting 50 German fund managers on a plane and taking them to the UK as part of a investment mission. That kind of stuff is really helpful, as is dealing with like local German regulations and the sort of stuff that doesn't rise to the EU level. But this just is not in the same ball game as a deal with the EU is.
What do you think of Starmer's approach so far? Because to many legacy Remainers, it kind of feels as though he could go a lot further, given his huge majority and the state of Euroscepticism and the state of the Tory party. And he could make hay if he wanted to, but clearly he's not going to, is he? But has he made the right noises? Is he moving in the right direction?
Actually, I'm going to give some credit to Rishi Sunak here, which is that you had already had, when Rishi Sunak came in, a sort of soft reset with the EU, where the Tories, or at least the number 10, stopped actively looking at every issue and going, how do we pick the most visible public fight with the European Union on this in order to get there? And that, I think, significantly improved relations and like working relationships on both sides of the channel already. And Keir Starmer's kind of kept that going, and that's good. In terms of people who want him to be more ambitious, I mean, I'm sure there are things he could be pushing harder, but I'm always like, if we scratch beneath the surface, as what you're really saying is you want him to announce that the UK is rejoining. There is a sort of a pathway for, we're going to join the customs union, we're going to join the single market, and then we're going to join the EU eventually. Is that what you're really disappointed he's not doing? And firstly, he kept telling you that wasn't the plan. And secondly, if you talk to Europe has very little appetite for that conversation at the moment and won't for quite some time.
And that's the show. Thanks to Hugo.
Thank you.
Marie.
Thank you.
And our guest today, Dimitri.
Thanks so much.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a hearty salute to our generous supporters, without whom we couldn't keep making podcasts. It's as simple as that. So why not join them for as little as £3 a month and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God, What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.
Hello, and many thanks and maximum respect to Calburn, Graham, and William Guthrie.
Thank you so much for paying into our fighting fund to the following legends, giants, and icons: Alan Daly, Les Augeret, and Nico.
And from me, it's effusive thanks, bordering on the mutually embarrassing, to Andy May, Ruth, and a specially warm greeting to Emma P., who has renewed her backing after it lapsed. Welcome back to the fold.